On a Tuesday morning in late October, 6 black SUVs rolled slowly down Grainer Street and stopped in front of a flower shop with a faded green awning and a handwritten, closed sign taped to the glass from the inside. The man standing on the sidewalk had a paper coffee cup in one hand and his daughter's school backpack in the other. He looked at the cars. He looked at the shop. He had not been back to this block since the morning he handed over everything he had left. The drivers stepped out first, then the lawyers, then a woman in a tailored gray coat carrying a leather portfolio the size of a small door. She walked straight toward him. He did not move. His daughter, 8 years old, pressed herself against his left side and watched the woman approach with the particular stillness of a child who has learned to read silence before she learned to read words. The woman stopped 3 feet away, opened the portfolio, and placed it on top of the car hood nearest to him. "It's yours," she said. "All of it." He stared at the document for a long time. His hands were cold. What Marcus Delloway did not know, on the night 6 months earlier when he slid a cashier's check for $1,400 under the door of that flower shop, was that the woman on the other side of that door was not simply a grieving widow who had fallen behind on rent. She was the majority shareholder of a property development group that owned 11 commercial buildings across 3 counties. Her name was Inez Carver, and she had spent 17 years building something quietly, the way certain people build things, without announcement, without audience, driven entirely by the specific grief of having lost someone who believed in her before she believed in herself. She had been sitting on the floor of that shop on that particular November night because it was the anniversary of her husband's death, and she had stopped answering calls, stopped eating, stopped everything, and the overdue rent notice from her own landlord had become a strange dark joke she could not explain to anyone. She had not told a single person that she was behind. Marcus had no idea. He only knew that she had looked tired when he had seen her through the window 3 days earlier, and that her lights had been off since. Do not look away from this story. Because what Marcus gave that night cost him something he could not get back, and what came back to him 6 months later was something he had never once imagined asking for. 6 months earlier, the 3rd week of October, Marcus Delloway was 34 years old, and he had been a single father for 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days. Not that he counted exactly, but the number lived in the back of his head the way certain numbers do when they are attached to the last day your life looked familiar. He worked mornings at a commercial print shop on Elm Corridor, running a Heidelberg offset press that smelled of ink and machine oil, arriving at 5:45 every day before the floor supervisor, before the fluorescent lights buzzed to life, before anyone else was there to witness the particular quiet of a man who had nowhere else to be at that hour. He earned $19.40 per hour. After taxes, after child support contributions to his daughter's school lunch account, after the auto draft on his 2011 Civic, he deposited roughly $2,100 into his checking account each month. Rent on his 2-bedroom apartment on Grainer Street was $1,350. That left $750 for everything else. Groceries, utilities, his daughter Lena's school supplies, the occasional broken thing that needed fixing, and the $100 buffer he kept in a separate account he refused to touch unless it was a genuine emergency, which it almost always was. On the morning of October 19th, his checking account balance was $43.17. Payday was 4 days away. He stood at his kitchen counter at 5:15 in the morning, drinking black coffee from a mug that said, "World's okayest dad." A gift from Lena, who had bought it with money from her piggy bank and presented it to him with tremendous seriousness, as if it were a trophy. The apartment was still. The radiator ticked. On the counter beside his mug sat a plain white envelope that had arrived 3 days ago and that he had not yet allowed himself to open, though he already knew what it contained, because the return address was from his landlord's management company, and the landlord's management company only sent white envelopes when the news was bad. At 6:22, Lena walked out of her bedroom in her school uniform. A gray sweater, dark navy trousers, small white sneakers she had insisted on tying herself since the age of 6, and placed herself at the kitchen table without being asked. She had her mother's eyes and her father's way of moving through a room, carefully, economically, as if she had already decided that taking up too much space was something she would have to earn. She poured her own cereal. She ate without talking, because she had noticed the white envelope on the counter, and she was 8 years old and old enough to know that certain silences deserved respect. Marcus watched her for a moment from the kitchen doorway. He looked away. He picked up his keys. "Ready," he said. She looked up at him and nodded once, with the gravity of a person 3 times her age. He walked her to school every morning, a 7-minute walk down Grainer Street, past the bakery, past the dry cleaner, past the flower shop with the faded green awning. And every morning she held his hand for exactly the first 4 minutes and then let go, which he had decided was her version of independence, and he had decided he was fine with it. On this particular morning, they passed Inez Carver's flower shop, and the lights inside were off, and the handwritten closed sign was in the window, and in the narrow strip of light from the street lamp, Marcus could see a yellow notice taped to the inside of the glass, a small rectangle of bureaucracy that he recognized immediately. He stopped walking. Lena stopped beside him. He looked at the notice for a long time. "Dad," she said. "It's nothing," he said. "Keep walking." But he looked back once, over his shoulder, at the dark shop and the yellow notice and the empty street. And he did not stop thinking about it for the rest of the day. The print shop where Marcus worked occupied the ground floor of a building that smelled permanently of solvent and hot metal, and the men who worked there had the particular camaraderie of people who spent 8 hours a day doing loud, physical, precise work together and almost never talked about their personal lives. His floor supervisor was a man named Dom, short for Dominic, 51 years old, thick-shouldered, with a gray mustache and the blunt conversational style of someone who had spent 3 decades deciding that most problems could be solved by simply acknowledging them plainly and then returning to work. Marcus respected Dom the way you respect someone who has never once tried to make you feel smaller. On the afternoon of October 19th, Marcus sat in the break room during his lunch half-hour and opened the white envelope. He read it twice. The notice was for overdue rent, 2 months past due, a total balance of $2,700, and it contained a formal notice of intent to file for eviction proceedings if the balance was not resolved within 30 days. He folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in his jacket pocket. He ate the rest of his sandwich. Dom came in partway through, poured a coffee, and stood at the counter with his back half turned. "You good?" Dom said without turning around. "Fine," Marcus said. Dom nodded, once, the way men of a certain generation nod when they know someone is lying but have decided to respect the lie. He left without saying anything else. Marcus sat with his coffee going cold and thought about Lena, specifically about the way she had poured her own cereal that morning without asking him for anything, and about how she did this not because she was self-sufficient but because she was watching him and had made her own quiet calculations about how much he could carry. That thought did something to him that he could not name. He sat with it. Then he stood up, folded his break room napkin into a neat square, threw it away, and walked back to the floor. That evening, walking home from picking up Lena from after-school care, they passed the flower shop again. The lights were still off. But now there was a second notice on the door, and this one was not yellow. It was the particular shade of red that Marcus associated with finality, and it had been placed directly over the first one. He stopped again. He stood there for a moment in the early November cold, his breath visible in the street lamp light, Lena's hand in his. Something in him did the math without being asked to. He thought about the $1,400 in rent he owed. He thought about the $1,400 this woman owed. He thought about how the money that had arrived in his account that morning, his payday, was the only thing standing between his daughter and a colder version of this same street. He was quiet for a long time. Lena looked up at him. "She doesn't have lights," Lena said. "No," he said. "She doesn't." He watched the dark shop for another moment. Then he turned and looked down at his daughter, and she looked up at him with her mother's eyes and her patient expression, and something in him settled. Not decided, settled. The way certain decisions don't feel like decisions at all. "Stay here," he said. "Right here." He walked to the ATM on the corner of Grainer and Fifth. He stood at the machine for a long time in the cold before he pressed anything. Then he withdrew his entire rent deposit, $1,400 in 20s, walked to the 24-hour check printing kiosk at the pharmacy 2 blocks over, converted it to a cashier's check made out to the Grainer Street Commercial Management Office, walked back to the flower shop, and slid the sealed envelope under the door. He stood there for a moment after. Then he walked back to where Lena was standing on the sidewalk, exactly where he had left her, holding her backpack with both hands. She looked at him. He held out his hand. She took it. They walked home. 2 days later, Dom appeared at Marcus's workstation mid-morning and placed a folded piece of paper next to his press without making eye contact or breaking pace. Marcus unfolded it during the next natural break in the press cycle. It was a company memo. The print shop was reducing its weekday morning crew from 6 operators to 4, effective in 2 weeks. The selection would be based on seniority. Marcus had been with the company for 14 months. 3rd least senior on the floor. He read it twice. He folded it. He put it in his jacket pocket next to the eviction notice. He went back to work. At the end of the shift, Dom stopped him at the door. "I'm fighting it," Dom said. "For what it's worth." "I know," Marcus said. "You've got a kid," Dom said. "I know," Marcus said again. Dom looked at him for a moment. "You want to tell me why you look like a man who already knew things were going to get worse?" Marcus looked at him. "No," he said quietly. "Not really." He walked out into the cold morning and did not look back. The first crisis came on a Friday morning, 10 days after Marcus had slid the envelope under the door. He had not told anyone about the money. He had not told Dom, had not told his sister in Columbus, had not told the woman at the non-profit childcare subsidy office. He called once a month to check whether the waitlist for Lena's after-school program had moved. He had simply not paid his rent, and the 30-day clock on his eviction notice had been running, and he had been working the math in his head every night the way a man works math when the numbers do not add up and he knows they do not add up, and he is doing it anyway because doing it feels like the only form of control left. The second notice from his landlord's management company arrived on a Thursday. This one was not a white envelope. It was a certified letter requiring a signature. He signed for it at the door in his work clothes at 6 in the morning, before Lena woke up, and he stood in the hallway and read it standing up because something in him knew that sitting down to read it would make it more real. It was a formal notice of eviction proceedings. He had 14 days to respond or vacate. He stood in the hallway for a long time. The radiator ticked. From down the hall through Lena's door, he could hear the particular stillness of a sleeping child, that specific quality of silence that is not empty but full, weighted with the unconscious trust of someone who believes, without examination, that they are safe. He went back to the kitchen. He placed the letter on the counter. He made coffee. He stood at the window and watched the street below. Gray early, the first yellow light touching the tops of the buildings, and he did not allow himself to think about where they would go, because there was nowhere to go, not immediately, not with 14 days and $43 and a daughter who tied her own shoes and poured her own cereal and was watching him with her mother's eyes every morning to see if he was still standing. He was still standing. That had to be enough. The second crisis came from a direction he had not anticipated. His neighbor across the hall, a retired postal worker named Gerald, who left his apartment door open on Sunday afternoons and always called Lena Little Miss Serious, knocked on his door on a Saturday morning and handed him a printout. It was a post on a neighborhood social media group. Someone, he did not know who, had posted about a suspicious transaction at the Grainer Street ATM on the night of October 19th, describing a man matching Marcus's description withdrawing a large cash amount and entering the closed flower shop. The post did not name him, but it described him precisely: his height, his jacket, the small child he had been with. And then someone in the comments had added his name. He stood in his doorway and read the thread. There were 41 comments. Most of them assumed the worst. He handed the printout back to Gerald without speaking. Gerald stood there, holding it, his expression carrying something between outrage and helplessness. "You want me to respond to it?" Gerald said. "I know people on that group." "No," Marcus said. "Marcus, leave it," he said. He closed the door. He stood in the middle of his living room and looked at nothing for a long time, at the still and familiar shapes of his apartment, the couch with the worn armrest, the small bookshelf Lena had decorated with drawings, the kitchen counter where the eviction letter sat folded and waiting, and he felt, for the first time since this had all begun, the specific weight of a man who has done the right thing in a world that is not organized around rewarding that. He thought about calling his sister. He did not call his sister. He sat down. And then Lena came out of her room. She walked to the couch. She sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. She did not ask what was wrong. She did not say anything. She simply sat there, with her small hands folded in her lap and her patient expression, and looked at the middle distance, the way he had seen her look at things when she was thinking something through. They sat together in the silence for a long time. His hands were cold. He looked at her hands. He looked at the wall. Somewhere down the block a car door closed. The radiator ticked. He did not break. 2 blocks away, in the back office of the flower shop she had never fully reopened, Inez Carver was on the phone with her attorney. She had found the envelope 3 days after it was slid under her door. She had sat on the floor of her shop for a long time holding it, because a cashier's check for exactly the amount of her commercial rent, made out in a stranger's name, left with no note, no ask, no return address. That was not a transaction she had the vocabulary for. Her attorney was telling her that the check was legitimate. She already knew that. What she did not know yet was the name on the check, or the apartment building 200 meters from her shop, or the floor supervisor named Dom who had already called 3 people he knew. But she was beginning to find out. The morning of April 14th arrived cold and clear, with a particular flat gray light of early spring that makes everything look like a photograph of itself. Sharp at the edges, still slightly unreal. Marcus was walking Lena to school. Same route. Same 7 minutes. Same 4 minutes of held hand. 3 minutes of quiet independence. They were 2 blocks from Lena's school when Marcus saw the first SUV. It was parked on Grainer Street, directly in front of the flower shop, and it was followed by 5 more, each one black, each one with tinted windows, and the convoy occupied the entire right side of the street and drew the attention of the 3 people waiting for the bus at the corner, and the woman walking her dog and the delivery driver who slowed his van to look. Marcus stopped. He stood on the sidewalk with his daughter's backpack in one hand and his paper coffee cup in the other, and he looked at the cars and then at the shop with the faded green awning and the handwritten, closed sign still in the window. The drivers stepped out. Then the lawyers carrying portfolios. Then a woman in a tailored gray coat who moved with the quiet authority of someone who did not need to announce herself. She walked directly toward Marcus. He did not recognize her immediately. She was dressed differently than the woman he had glimpsed through the shop window on those November evenings, the one in the flower-dusted apron and the tired expression. And then she stepped into the clear morning light and he recognized her eyes. Inez Carver looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "I've been trying to find you since February." He looked at her. "You found me," he said. She almost smiled. "Dom found you," she said. "He called someone who called someone." She placed the portfolio on the hood of the nearest car and opened it. Marcus looked at the documents inside without comprehending them immediately. The legal language, the transfer of title, the property description on Grainer Street, and then he looked up. "I don't understand," he said. "You paid my rent," she said. "With money you didn't have. For a woman you didn't know." He was quiet. "That's not," he started. "I know what it cost you," she said. "Dom told me about the layoff notice. The eviction. All of it." He said nothing. Beside him, Lena was watching Inez Carver with absolute stillness. Her small hands at her sides, her expression unreadable. One of the lawyers stepped forward. "Mr. Delloway," the lawyer said. "Mrs. Carver is transferring ownership of the Grainer Street commercial property, the shop, its inventory, and the commercial lease on the 2 attached units, to you effective today. There's also a trust instrument for—" "Stop," Marcus said. The lawyer stopped. Marcus looked at Inez. "Why?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Because my husband taught me that the people who give when they have nothing are the only ones worth giving everything to." The bus stop woman had stopped pretending not to watch. The dog walker had stopped walking. Dom, who had appeared from somewhere. Marcus had not seen him arrive, but there he was, standing at the edge of the small crowd that had gathered. Had his arms crossed and his jaw set, and the expression of a man who has been holding a secret for 2 months and is profoundly relieved that the holding is over. Lena looked up at her father. He was looking at the documents. His hands were cold. She reached up and took his hand. He looked down at her. Something moved across his face. Not relief exactly, not triumph, not even joy, quite. More like the specific expression of a man who has been carrying something alone for so long that the moment someone takes the other handle, the weight doesn't disappear, it simply becomes for the first time real. He looked back at Inez. "She needs to get to school," he said. "Can we?" "Of course," Inez said. "I'll be here." He walked Lena the rest of the way to school. He held her hand the entire 7 minutes. She let him. 6 months later, the flower shop on Grainer Street had a new awning, deep navy blue, with clean white lettering that said Delloway and Carver Esti. This year. And a handwritten chalkboard sign in the window that listed the day's arrangements by name. Inside, Marcus ran the front operations while Inez kept a consulting role, coming in on Tuesdays and Thursdays, teaching him the supply chains and the seasonal rhythms and the particular language of people who walk into a flower shop because something in their life has just changed. The eviction notice was framed on the wall of the back office behind the desk, next to a school photograph of Lena in her gray sweater and white sneakers. Her expression in the photo precisely as it had always been. Watchful, patient, and faintly amused. The social media post had been addressed, quietly and factually, by Gerald, who turned out to be someone people in the neighborhood actually listened to, and the comments had reversed entirely, and Marcus had neither read the new ones nor cared about them particularly. Dom came in on the shop's first official open day and bought a bouquet of yellow sunflowers. He placed them on the counter. He looked at Marcus. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I told you I was fighting it." "You fought it differently than I expected," Marcus said. "Yeah," Dom said. "Well." He picked up his change. He turned to leave. He stopped at the door. "Lena still call you world's okayest dad?" Marcus smiled, not the full version but enough. "Every morning," he said. Dom nodded once. He walked out into the morning. There is a version of this story where Marcus Delloway keeps his $1,400, pays his rent, and avoids the eviction, the social media post, the 2 weeks of sleeping less than 5 hours a night, the specific cold dread of a man watching his daughter pour her own cereal because she is trying to take care of him. There is a version where he does the sensible thing. In that version, the flower shop closes. And Inez Carver spends the anniversary of her husband's death, sitting on the floor of it alone. And nobody finds out. This is not that version. If you stayed until the end of this video, you already know that Marcus did not get back what he gave. He got back something else entirely. Not because the universe runs a ledger, not because kindness is a transaction, but because the kind of person who gives when they have nothing left is also, as it turns out, exactly the kind of person certain other people spend their whole lives looking for.